There are no shortage of great Seiko watches throughout history. And while most of us think of many of the great dive watches that have come from the brand over the years, myself certainly included, there are plenty of hidden gems from the brand that might fall into slightly different categories. I've got one of these watches with me today that I wanted to talk about. It is the Seiko 5H23 6030. This is a really interesting watch for quite a few reasons, and it comes from a great era, the mid-80s. There are lots of really interesting, unusual, risk-taking designs from Seiko and frankly a lot of other brands in the mid-80s, and this is certainly one of them. Now, like many of you, when I think of weird, funky watches from the 80s from Seiko, I generally think of watches like the Ripley, the SSB A018, or even watches like the SSA Y058, Giorgetto Gregario designs that we all know and love and that have become kind of cultural staples from the brand. I love watches like that. And the 5H23 6030 is in a similar vein, but in my opinion, it's a lot more approachable than those watches. So what is this watch? This was a Japan market sport watch. It has the Sports 100 mark on the dial, and it is dripping with a retro futuristic vibe that I really love. This is a design style that we've seen kind of making a comeback in recent years, and there's something about watches that are originally from that era that just can't quite be captured in modern products trying to emulate it. This watch has a lot of great qualities that we would prize in much higher end watches, but it's also distinctly its own thing. The 5H23 6030 is kind of an all-purpose sports watch, and it's been designed with an emphasis on ergonomics. This is a 36mm watch that measures just 8.7mm in thickness. It achieves this thanks to the 5H22 quartz movement inside that is accurate to within plus or minus 15 seconds per month. This was a pretty robust caliber when it came out, and it saw pretty broad usage from Seiko in the era. Now, as you might expect with those measurements, this watch wears beautifully on the wrist. And while most of it comes down to those measurements, that also falls on the bracelet, which is a really interesting flat link tapered design. It might look integrated to the case, but it is actually fit to a traditional spring bar between a set of hooded lugs at the top and bottom of the case. There is a real silky quality about this bracelet that I love, and paired with the very thin thickness measurement, it really kind of equals a fantastic experience on the wrist that's not all that far off from watches like a 15202 or 5711 or much higher end watches that we love for their trim measurements. But this watch, of course, is using a quartz movement to get there. But it's a movement that makes sense for this watch and for the era. It's a super charming watch on the wrist overall, and it has a really interesting design to back it up. This is an overall kind of retro futuristic design in the shape of the case, the design of the bracelet, the bezel, and the dial. Now, there is a tri-point theme going on with this watch that starts with the bezel insert that's framing the dial. It has notches at 12 o'clock, at 4 o'clock, and at 8 o'clock. And that's followed through on the dial with triangular hour markers at those same positions. Further reinforcing this is the crown placement at 4 o'clock. The dial is also really interesting for the use of a grid pattern, which is red over the top of a matte black base. There's something very Tron-like about this, and it also reminds me a bit of the Autodromo Group B night stage watches. Now, those watches, of course, take their inspiration from the dashes of Group B rally cars, and this has a bit of the same vibe, and it's actually from the mid-80s, so again, it just feels that much more authentic in its appearance. There's also a day and date complication here, fit at 3 o'clock. So each of the components of this watch are very interesting in their own right. The finish of the case and bracelet is a uniform satin, almost bead blasted type finish. It's dark in appearance. It looks a bit like titanium. Now, using titanium here would feel a bit unnecessary considering trim size of this watch. It's already exceedingly light as a result. The whole thing weighs just 68 grams, which is pretty impressive. Now, there's no fancy features in the clasp like quick extensions or anything like that. This is really just a straightforward watch while having this rather unusual kind of funky design. It really strikes a great balance that watches like those Gregario designs that I mentioned earlier don't really have. Overall, this watch feels very much like a product of its era, and it feels like a watch that you just don't really see these days. I could see a micro brand coming out with something similar to this, but when it comes to Seiko themselves, I just don't see them dabbling in this kind of a form factor again anytime soon, as much as I would love to see it. So I mentioned that this was a Japan market watch, and that makes them relatively tricky to find on the open market. When they do come up, though, they can be had for under $500. Overall, this is a hugely charming watch on the wrist with a highly distinctive personality that really leans into the retro vibes of the 80s. It is among many of the hidden gems from Seiko and many other brands throughout the 80s and the 90s that might get overshadowed by some of the more premium offerings from these brands these days. But there's a quality in watches from this era that is just not captured in most of the watches that we see today. Watches like this really offer a special experience, and I wish that they were a little bit easier to find on the open market. Seriously, if you come across one of these things, it's definitely worth a try. I've got a lot more of my thoughts on the Seiko 5H23 6030 now live over on thedeeptrack.com. I'll leave a link to that down below. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this watch. Is this a watch that you were familiar with? Had you heard of this watch? What do you think of this thing? Let me know down in the comments below. All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you enjoy this content, a like, a share, a subscribe really helps out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, take care.